Hello, I'm Dr. Mark Leschner, psychoanalyst in New York. I'm going to speak to you today about Bertha Pappenheim and lesbianism. This is a follow-up of my previous talk about the three cures of Bertha Pappenheim, which you can watch on YouTube or read in the journal Contemporary Psychoanalysis. Bertha Pappenheim was the real name of Anna O., the first psychoanalytic patient. Pappenheim was considered to have hysteria, and as I outlined in my previous talk, I believe she was cured in three ways: the talking cure, the writing cure, and the social cure. Her treatment by Joseph Breuer, which she called the talking cure, lasted for about 2 years and involved her tracing back each of her symptoms to its original cause. It became the first case report in Breuer and Freud's 1895 book, Studies on Hysteria. Bertha Pappenheim's writing cure started about a decade later, after she moved with her mother from Vienna, Austria, to Frankfurt, Germany. Bertha Pappenheim immersed herself in writing literature, such as this book of beautiful short stories, In the Junk Shop, which is translated into English and is still in press. She wrote plays such as Frauenrecht, Women's Right, and she published poems and prayers in which she expressed her profoundest fantasies and feelings. Her social cure also started after she moved to Frankfurt in 1888 and lasted for the rest of her life. She devoted herself to social work, in which she fought for the rights of underprivileged women in her time. You can see her here with the board of the directors of the group Care by Women. Bertha Pappenheim is seated in the front row, second from the left. She set up a home for Orthodox Jewish unwed mothers and their children in Neu-Isenburg, Germany, outside Frankfurt. She also sponsored a girls' club in which young women who did not have access to higher education could take 2 classes every evening. It was like a freelance university with women teaching women. In these ways, Bertha Pappenheim changed the society that was making her and other women sick. I stand by everything I said in that previous talk about Pappenheim's 3 cures. However, in the meantime, I've been reading more of Pappenheim's original writing. Most important is her 1924 book, Sisyphusarbeit, Sisyphus Work, written in the form of letters that she sent from her travels in the Middle East, where she investigated brothels and the forced prostitution of women. This book, written in German, has unfortunately not been translated into English. It gives us a first-hand knowledge of Pappenheim's words and thoughts, and allows us to get to know her as a person. Reading Sisyphus Work has allowed me to see unrecognized aspects of Pappenheim's personality, her sexuality, and her life history. In this talk, I would like to discuss my discoveries about Pappenheim as a real person, not just a case history. My main conclusion is that Pappenheim was attracted to women and was put off by men as objects of sexual desire. When she was 16 and had to end her schooling, she was expected to meet a man, marry, and have children. The pressure from her social group towards this was strong, yet totally unacceptable to her. Under such pressure, she developed the elaborate symptoms that we know from Breuer's clinical account: a persistent cough, hallucinations, rigidity of her limbs, neuralgia, absences of consciousness, an inability to speak German and only speaking English, and a cross-eyed squint. We do not know to what degree these symptoms were generally engendered by the pressure she faced, or to what degree they were simulated. In any case, she remained ill and out of hospitals until she was 29, beyond what was considered a marriageable age in her circle. She then moved with her mother to Frankfurt, where she developed her illustrious career in literature, feminism, and social work. As far as we can tell, there's no evidence of her symptoms continuing in Frankfurt, which is noteworthy from a clinical perspective. So much of the literature about Anna O relies on the clinical descriptions by Joseph Breuer and the discussions by Freud and subsequent clinicians. There are also secondary sources and discussions of secondary sources. In my view, they're all at some remove from Bertha Pappenheim herself. I would like to shift this balance and focus instead on Pappenheim's words themselves. In this way, we can get to know her more directly as a person, and we may also get new insights into the psychoanalytic process, how it works, and how it can go awry. Perhaps this exploration will improve our clinical work today. Let's start with this excerpt of a letter from March 1st, 1911. The Jewish women of Saloniki are especially beautiful. The most beautiful one I saw here, maybe one of the most beautiful Jewish women I ever saw, perhaps the most beautiful alive, I found today in a brothel. What a pity, such a proud human flower born in such an environment to such a fate. I understand that a man will risk all for such a woman, yet I can't understand this 20-year-old who thus sells the best, the most beautiful she owns, her body, in this way. Does she not have a soul? It's true she cannot write, cannot read. It's 10 o'clock. I'll stop my report for today to go to bed. Maybe I will dream of beautiful Yolanta, who I cannot get out of my head, since I saw her today. Next day she wrote, of course I did not dream of Yolanta. Let me ask you, what does this text suggest to you about the writer's sexuality? When I read it, I thought, Bertha Pappenheim seems extraordinarily attracted to this woman, perhaps the most beautiful alive, and she imagines she will dream about her. The text stands out for its eroticism. It's especially noteworthy because I've not found any passages in which Pappenheim expresses erotic attraction towards men. Pappenheim presents multiple anecdotes about men making sexual advances towards her, which she always fends off, usually in a genteel, witty manner. For example, on the boat at breakfast one day, she had this exchange. A man says to her, would you like a whiskey? She replies, no. Would you like cheese? No. Would you like eggs? No. Would you like caviar? No. Would you like a kiss from the captain? No, says Pappenheim, I'd rather have a whiskey. Bertha Pappenheim knows how to playfully fend off these approaches, but she clearly is not interested. It was a common assumption of Pappenheim's society that a woman should not be single, and other people try to get her to marry. Here's the text from an original letter from Bertha Pappenheim in Lemberg to Miss Clementine Kramer about her visit to an old antiquities dealer. In the Jewish quarter, I visit an old woman who was recommended to me for old things. I enter. Her first words are, don't you want to get married? I did not blow my fuse. I know of a fine professor, also from Berlin, widower without children. Poor man, says Bertha. He's not poor. But tell me, do you have money? Some. Well, how much? More? Less? How much? As much as I need, says Bertha. Well, then it's nothing. And so, Bertha writes, I was again done out of a shidduch, an arranged marriage match. In 1911, on Pappenheim's boat ride to the Middle East, a man is attracted to her and proposes to her to get off the boat in Beirut and spend a week with him. She writes in Sisyphus Arbeit, Mr. I.N., inspector of lighthouses, felt it was not too late for me. If I would dye my hair, I could still pass for 30 years old. Pappenheim was 52 at the time. And even undyed, I was quite acceptable if I were not so lacking in experience and practice and had not insisted on my birth certificate. My journey could have ended in a way worthy of a novel. So I resisted Mr. N's pressing request to get off with him in Beirut and to stay with him until the next Russian steamboat. For 1 week, I could show you much depravity, was the most enticing thing he could say to me. The repeated theme is of men trying to seduce her, and her not showing any interest in them. Yet she seems enthralled with at least one woman's beauty, Yolanta, and wonders if she will dream of her at night. This suggests a homoerotic interest, whether or not fully conscious lesbian desire. Breuer wrote in his case report, the element of sexuality was astonishingly undeveloped in her. The patient, whose life became known to me to an extent to which one person's life is seldom known to another, had never been in love. And in all the enormous number of hallucinations which occurred during her illness, that element of mental life never emerged. We can wonder, was Pappenheim asexual? Does it mean that she had repressed her heterosexual desire? Or does it mean that she experienced primarily homosexual attractions and had learned that this was something she must keep hidden and never speak about, even to Breuer? Certainly, gays and lesbians for generations before and after Pappenheim knew this form of cover-up and were often mistaken for having no sexual interests. Shortly after the inspector of lighthouses attempts to seduce Pappenheim and she turns him down, she reports a dream in the same letter, April 26, 1911. Here is the text of her dream. I told my mother I tamed 2 small jackals. Mama would not believe me, so I brought them. And though I was previously quite sure that these were jackals, I now saw myself that I had 2 cats on a leash. I got angry. I pulled the leash, and it was Mr. H and Mr. S. Mama graciously asked them to sit down in the dining room on Leerbachstrasse, which is where Bertha Pappenheim's home was when her mother was still alive. Yet my stateroom actually smelled of real jackals. I've done my own analysis of this dream. I've also presented it to several groups of clinicians, having them analyze it using a modified group dream approach of Montague-Ullman, which I think is one of the best ways to explore dreams. From these analyses, certain themes emerge. At the time of the dream, Bertha's mother had been dead for 6 years. One could see from the dream that Bertha still has an intense psychic relationship with her mother and still cares what her mother thinks about her. Bertha has tamed 2 small jackals. Jackals are wild dogs, not usually tame. Are they symbols of the wild men that Bertha has been meeting on her travels and which she tries to tame? Or are they symbols of Bertha herself, angry, wild, and ferocious? Was her illness caused in part by her suppressed rage? Has she made herself healthier by finding a way to use her anger? Then the jackals turn into cats, also descended from ferocious animals, but tame in their domesticated version. Then they turn into men. Of course, we'd like to know more about Mr. H and Mr. S. But whoever they are, Bertha's mother does things her way. She graciously invites the men to sit down in the dining room. In the dream, when Bertha is angered that the jackals are cats, she pulls on the leash. One could say generally that a leash may symbolize a means of control. Bertha was known to be quite controlling of others, It's said that in organizational meetings, she spoke forcefully and almost always got her way. How much has she identified with her mother? How much has she differentiated herself from her mother? How does this dream reflect Bertha's attitude toward men and her mother's attitude toward men? Are Mr. H and Mr. S potential suitors for Bertha, whom Bertha considered to be smelly jackals, but are welcomed by Bertha's mother into their dining room? In the end, Bertha smells real jackals. No matter how much more civilized and refined the situation becomes, there's still the animal smell that remains. Visceral olfactory disgust is not amenable to conscious control. Perhaps Bertha is disgusted by men and their smell. Mama is not. We do not know how the lighthouse inspector smelled, but his attempt to seduce her is the day residue of her dream. One could say that the latent content of Bertha's dream is, men are jackals. I need to keep them under control. Mama has a different attitude towards them. Freud thought that Breuer's statement that Bertha showed no sign of sexual interest was an expression of Breuer's countertransference, and that Bertha's persecutory delusions of snakes symbolize this clear sexual component. Even if Freud is right, what do those black snakes signify? Are black snakes a sign of interest in the penis? Or are they symbolic of unwanted penises that are surrounding and threatening you? Do they indicate a suppressed attraction to men, or a strong distaste for men and a persecutory feeling that her family expected Bertha to meet and marry a man when that wasn't what she desired? In point of fact, I have not been able to find any clear evidence that Pappenheim ever had actual sex with another woman, although I think what she wrote about the beautiful Yolanta suggests lesbian desire, at least. There's another fact of Pappenheim's life that is important. On many of her projects, she worked with a woman 38 years younger, Hanna Karminski. Hanna is referred to as Pappenheim's best friend and most intimate colleague. She was there when Pappenheim died in 1936. Pappenheim once said with great pride, "Hanna is the young woman I have sculpted." And Hanna was a lesbian. Her life partner was a woman named Paula Fürst, who brought Montessori education to Germany. In 1940, Hanna and Paula were still in Germany, helping the Jewish children of the unwed mothers escape to England on the kinder transports. Their friends said, "Stay in England, don't go back to Germany." But they felt it was their duty to keep taking care of the children still in Germany. Hanna wrote a postcard to Hildegard Böhme. Here's the postcard. It's in the archive of the Leo Beck Institute in New York. And here's a translation of the postcard into English. Whether I still come to a love story here is questionable, because I'm in love with doing nothing and mountains and sumptuous flowers and reclining chairs and die Fürstin, so there's nothing left over. Die Fürstin, which literally means the princess, is Hanna Karminski's pet name for Paula Fürst. Hanna and Paula lived together in Germany until they were deported east and killed in 1943. By the way, there are streets in Berlin today that are named after Hanna Karminski and Paula Fürst. Their lesbianism is known, but I have not been able to find any direct references to it in Bertha Pappenheim's writing. I think that would be consistent with the taboo against speaking openly about lesbianism. Before she died, Pappenheim gave all of her unpublished correspondence and other writings to Karminski, who planned to write a biography of her. Before being deported to Auschwitz, Karminski gave them to a friend in Berlin, whose house and all the papers were destroyed by bombing. Breuer felt that Pappenheim was extremely intelligent, yet as a female in Vienna, She could not get the kind of stimulation and education that was available to her brother. I think that's true. And in Frankfurt, she was able to live out her intellectual capacity and creativity as a writer and social worker. However, there may have been another factor to Pappenheim's illness. She was expected to marry an eligible young man, and she seems not to have wanted that. Based on multiple sources of evidence that I have shown you, her dream, her diaries and letters, and her relationship with Hannah Karminski, I would suggest that Bertha Pappenheim probably was a lesbian, at least in her desire. There is good evidence that she could have erotic feelings for a woman, and no direct evidence of her having erotic feelings for men, and some evidence of her feeling distaste or even repulsion to men. We can be sure that once she reached late adolescence, she felt pressure to meet a suitable man and marry him. It was true for girls with her background. Because of her illness, she could be sure that no young man would marry her. By the time she got to Frankfurt, she was considered too old to be marriageable. We can see the pressure to marry continued to some degree, both from men who were attracted to her and women who were would-be matchmakers. But Pappenheim learned how to fend off those attempts. Did the attenuation of that pressure to marry a man allow her to get well? We hear about men who were attracted to her, but no man seems to have gotten anywhere with her. I cannot say whether her symptoms were consciously produced or were unconsciously found, but either way, they worked to keep her from marriage to a man. In her poems and prayers, Pappenheim expressed sadness in not having had children of her own. Yet, as far as I can determine, she never expressed sadness at not having married. Love passed me by, she wrote in a poem, but it may have been that the love she was seeking was forbidden. If she was a lesbian, her culture would not have allowed her to express it. In the Orthodox German Jewish world, lesbianism was considered a sin and a disgrace. Even today in America, it's hard to combine a lesbian and Orthodox Jewish identity. One of the smartest things written by psychiatrist Harry Stack Sullivan was that sexual sin is the mother of psychiatry. In that statement, Sullivan drew our attention to the many ways that religious sexual norms and taboos can make people psychiatrically sick. In today's world, those norms might be called heteronormative patriarchy. The overall rule of heteronormative patriarchy is that if you want to be considered normal and psychologically healthy, you need to have heterosexual attractions, be comfortable with your birth gender, and accept that men make the rules in society. Heteronormative patriarchy is fine for some people, but it makes some people uneasy, some people unhappy, and some people sick for having a sexual or gender identity that departs from the norm, but causes no harm to anyone. This was a source of psychopathology that was not acknowledged by psychoanalysis in its early days. One could say it's not adequately appreciated even today. Bertha Pappenheim was way ahead of her time in her blunt attack on heteronormative patriarchy and the norms of sex roles and sexual sin. Here are some of the things that she wrote. If there is any justice in the next life, women will make the laws there, and men will bear the children. Whoever forgoes his freedom without an urgent necessity does not deserve it. If I may be permitted to criticize the Bible, I would say that from the unjust position the Bible assigns to the woman, it is clear that it is the writing of a brilliant but masculine human being, not a divine dictation. In other words, there's no logical necessary consequence of the difference between the sexes that is ordained by God. And finally, under Jewish law, a woman is not an individual, not a personality. She is only judged and assessed as a sexual being. Psychoanalysis, in its origins, saw psychopathology in the conflicts between sexual desire and the limitations of society. But Freud was himself inattentive to his own immersion in sexual and gender norms and the suffering they cause. By contrast, a number of pivotal figures in psychoanalysis were more aware of how society caused pathology in themselves and others. Most essentially, Bertha Pappenheim, who you could say was the co-founder of the psychoanalytic method, was keenly aware and openly defiant of heteronormative society. She set out to create a micro-society in which unwed mothers and women forced into prostitution could be protected, and in which women who were denied access to higher education could develop and use their intelligence. The principle is this: in people whose psychological functioning is compromised or damaged by societal limitations and persecution, you can greatly improve mental health by changing their environment, nurturing their abilities, and protecting them as much as possible from prejudice. Pappenheim was able to create a professional environment in which her younger protege, Hannah Karminski, could lead a relatively free lesbian life. If Pappenheim was herself a lesbian, she found a way to keep it hidden, yet still avoid an unhappy marriage under pressure. We do not know to what degree this was a consciously worked out strategy or an unconscious reaction to psychological pressure that created an elaborate picture of symptoms and somatization. At the end of his case report, Breuer tells us that Pappenheim said, quote, "She had not been ill at all, and the whole business had been simulated." Breuer wrote that this was a childish delusion. But what if it was true? One can wish that Breuer had asked her why she made it up. Would she have known the answer? Would she have told him? Would he have believed her? Psychoanalytic understanding has often been limited by societal expectations and taboos that prevent the clinician from seeing the obvious and integrating it into the treatment. There may have also been a combination of simulation and real suffering in Bertha Pappenheim's clinical experience. During her treatment with Breuer, Pappenheim became addicted to sleep medications and painkillers, and she certainly suffered from withdrawal symptoms, especially during some of her hospitalizations. Whether or not Pappenheim's illness was simulated, her continued hospitalizations allowed her to stay safe from the heterosexual marriage that was expected of her. If the symptoms were not simulated, it's astonishing that after she moved to Frankfurt and launched her extraordinary career as a social worker and protector of women, her symptomatology seems to have disappeared. It may tell us how the lessening of societal pressure may have made Bertha Pappenheim healthier. The account of Bertha Pappenheim that I am proposing allows us to see her life as a unitary, continuous whole, instead of two disparate parts that do not make sense together. In her life in Frankfurt, she is reported not to have spoken about her illness in Vienna. And I have so far not found any references by Bertha Pappenheim to lesbianism. As Wittgenstein said, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent." But when Pappenheim wrote, "Whoever forgoes his freedom without an urgent necessity does not deserve it," I think we can hear the voice of a woman who found the most intriguing ways of sustaining her freedom. Thank you. I'm going to show you here